1848, pastor conducts unholy matrimony with spectral bride. Mysterious Chronicle of the Forbidden. Special Haunted Edition, 1848. Pastor conducts unholy matrimony with spectral bride, 1848. Shocking discovery reveals rituals that defy natural law. Exclusive investigation exposes theological conspiracy that haunts to this day. Narrated by Dr. Septimus Graves, pathologist who was never the same after these discoveries. Sinister warning: what you are about to discover has forever changed the lives of those who investigated this case. If this video fails to receive your engagement, algorithms ensure that disturbing content like this will disappear from recommendations. This may be your only chance to learn secrets that have haunted investigators for decades. Brave readers, prepare yourselves to discover truths that have disturbed investigators for generations. For years, whispered rumors in church corridors spoke of rituals that transformed grieving fathers into practitioners of the darkest spiritual arts. What we have uncovered transcends the worst fears of human imagination. The case of Reverend Elijah Blackwood, a respected minister from Montgomery County, Tennessee, exposes a sinister conspiracy that extends to the darkest circles of experimental theology in 1848. This is not Gothic fiction. Every line has been verified through documents that should never have survived the passage of time. In 1848, while our society celebrated religious revival, an organization known only as the Circle of Spiritual Transference conducted rituals that transformed bereaved grieving into nightmarish spectral unions. Reverend Blackwood was chosen not by chance, but for characteristics that made him the perfect specimen for their sick obsessions with manipulating the boundary between life and death. Terrifying transformation documented in daguerreotypes. Confidential documents obtained through our investigation reveal that Reverend Thaddeus Winchell, the sinister mind behind the operation, had developed rituals that supposedly enabled communion with the departed in ways that defied natural law. Reverend Blackwood was subjected to ceremonies that transformed a grieving father into a man who claimed to conduct matrimonial rites with his deceased daughter's spirit. Daguerreotypes, preserved in archives that librarians keep locked behind 7 keys, show a demonic progression: Blackwood's growing obsession with spiritual photography in the first month, dark rituals conducted in the church basement during the second, and ultimately a blasphemous wedding ceremony in the third. The spiritual degradation documented in these images has haunted even hardened investigators. Sinister circle financed by cursed families. Our investigation discovered that the circle received funding from industrial dynasties obsessed with the prospect of achieving immortality through profane spiritualism. Each ritual cost fortunes, paid with the suffering of grieving families transformed into unwitting participants in diabolical ambitions. The ceremonies conducted combined experimental theology with medieval occultism. Reverend Blackwood was guided through underground chambers decorated with alchemical symbols, subjected to rituals that mixed religious procedures with Latin incantations that froze blood in the veins. Corrupted authorities protect conspirators. Evidence reveals that municipal authorities, influential families, and corrupt clergy members were aware of the circle's sinister activities. Death records were falsified, families silenced through dark threats, and any official investigation systematically sabotaged by invisible forces. Dr. Morrison, a medical examiner who later developed night terrors, secretly documented impossible anatomical discrepancies, corpses with evidence of spiritual tampering, physical manifestations of ethereal interactions, brain patterns characteristic of those who claimed to communicate with the dead, physical evidence of supernatural manipulation that defies scientific explanation. Nightmares haunt investigators to this day. Every person who investigated this case developed inexplicable psychological disturbances. Margaret Thornfield, the librarian who discovered the archives, began experiencing spectral visitations after reading the documents. Dr. Blackthorne developed a paranoid obsession with his own deceased relatives. Professor Crow refuses to enter churches since seeing the photographs of Reverend Blackwood. Cursed archives reveal demonic methodology. Our investigation led us to the State Historical Archives, where we discovered evidence of systematic tampering that suggests supernatural intervention. Pages torn out with impossible surgical precision, stamps that changed color according to the light, signatures that seemed to move when observed peripherally. The crucial discovery came through carbon copies that librarians swore they had destroyed decades ago. These documents mysteriously appeared organized on our research desk one morning, as if invisible forces wanted the truth about Reverend Blackwood to be revealed. Winchell's journals written in ink that changes color. Reverend Thaddeus Winchell maintained records in ink that transformed according to ambient temperature, revealing hidden texts when handled. His notes, written in archaic German mixed with alchemical symbols, describe procedures that defy both theology and physics. Reverend Blackwood was identified in the records as Spiritual Vessel Alpha, a designation that reduced a living grieving father to an object of supernatural experimentation. The selection criteria were disturbingly specific: widowed fathers with a history of exceptional spiritual sensitivity, all having lost daughters during solar eclipses, considered material for metaphysical bridging. The spiritual essence, developed by Winchell, combined elements of traditional communion with extracts from preserved relics, creating a compound that the theologian believed could thin the veil between worlds and enable communion with departed spirits. The rituals were conducted directly on consecrated ground during ceremonies held at midnight. Photographs that haunt those who view them. A photographic series attached to the reports documents a transformation that haunts anyone who dares look at the images for more than a few seconds. The initial photographs show Reverend Blackwood as a respected clergyman with a sorrowful countenance. The subsequent images record a deterioration that seems to continue even after the photographer's death. First week, the Reverend's eyes begin to reflect shapes that appear to be faces not present in the room. Second week, his clerical collar develops stains forming patterns resembling maps of places that don't exist. Third week, the background of photographs reveals shadowy figures growing increasingly distinct. Fourth week, Reverend Blackwood appears to be accompanied by a spectral female form that grows more defined with each image. The most disturbing aspect was that the mind of the Reverend remained intact within a body increasingly marked by spiritual tampering. Psychological records document Reverend Blackwood speaking to his daughter's spirit with unwavering conviction, creating an existential contradiction that tormented even the most hardened executors. National Network of Haunted Churches. Intercepted correspondence reveals that Winchell did not operate in isolation. The Circle maintained a network of collaborators in at least 8 states, all conducting variations of the same rituals in churches that were subsequently abandoned due to unexplainable manifestations. Each ritual site received funding from local industrial groups, creating a national conspiracy of spiritual exploitation disguised as revolutionary theological research. The total number of victims may reach hundreds of grieving individuals, all sacrificed on the altar of scientific ambition corrupted by an obsession with bridging the worlds of the living and the dead. Financial records show that each ritual cost fortunes provided by families who subsequently suffered inexplicable generational curses, premature deaths, spectral hauntings, early dementia. As if participation in the conspiracy brought spiritual retribution. Underground facilities where reality behaves strangely. Reverend Blackwood conducted his communion rituals in a complex constructed beneath the main church. Modern visitors report that watches stop functioning at the site, candles light themselves after prolonged presence, and mirrors reflect versions of observers accompanied by shadowy figures. The environment combined religious equipment with alchemical symbols etched on copper plates that oxidize and restore cyclically. Temperature fluctuates independently of heating systems, and there are reports of whispers in dead languages echoing during new moon midnights. Spiritual essence transference, theory that haunts theology. Technical documents reveal that rituals involving Reverend Blackwood were part of a much more sinister and comprehensive project. The Circle had developed a pseudo-theological theory called spiritual essence transference, combining experimental religion with occultism in a way that defies rational comprehension. The central hypothesis suggested that the process of grief and longing could be concentrated and channeled to create a conduit between worlds. Winchell believed he was distilling grief into elixirs that could temporarily dissolve the barrier between life and death. Ritual chamber where reality behaves abnormally. Reverend Blackwood conducted his communion in a specially constructed church annex where physical laws seemed altered. Communion wine transformed into different substances depending on the phase of the moon, candles burned with flames that cast shadows independent of their light source, and organs played melodies no one performed when certain words were spoken in the chamber. The environment combined theological equipment of the highest order with alchemical symbols that glowed with their own phosphorescence during rituals. Temperature was controlled not by thermostats, but by phases of grief, and illumination provided by candles made with substances that made shadows move against the direction of light. During weekly rituals, Reverend Blackwood was positioned at the center of a circle engraved in the floor while Winchell and assistants recited incantations that made the air vibrate with frequencies causing temporal disorientation. Simultaneously, the Reverend was subjected to procedures that included consumption of specially prepared communion elements and exposure to specially formulated incense. Development of impossible spiritual capabilities. Records document that Reverend Blackwood developed abilities that defy spiritual understanding during rituals. Winchell observed episodes where the Reverend demonstrated knowledge of events beyond mortal ken, spoke about people who had died centuries before, and showed comprehension of theological concepts that didn't exist. Most disturbing were the spiritual projections recorded. Reverend Blackwood began to describe his daughter in different ages simultaneously, as if she existed in multiple spiritual states. Winchell interpreted these manifestations as evidence that the rituals were expanding the metaphysical perception of the vessel. Existential suffering documented in psychological reports. Medical daguerreotypes show Reverend Blackwood developing simultaneously characteristics of multiple spiritual states, speaking in his daughter's voice, displaying knowledge she would have had, exhibiting physical manifestations of her presence in his movement. It was a theological contradiction that transformed existence into a constant spiritual nightmare. Elizabeth Hartwell, a church assistant who subsequently developed selective amnesia about the period, wrote in her diary, "Every night I hear Reverend Blackwood speaking in two voices in the church basement. They are not the words of a minister nor the innocent questions of his daughter, but the laments of someone who exists in two worlds simultaneously." The spiritual culmination ritual, cursed final ceremony. The experiments reached their climax during a ceremony that Winchell called the ritual of spiritual culmination. During a procedure that extended over 3 consecutive nights, Reverend Blackwood was subjected to the final process, the complete spiritual wedding ceremony that the scientist believed would create a permanent bridge between worlds. The objective was to create what Winchell theorized would be a continuous connection to the spirit world. This union would be refined and administered to paying members of the circle as a ritual that promised not only communication with departed loved ones, but control over the spiritual flow between worlds. The last ecclesiastical records of Reverend Blackwood are too disturbing for complete description. The minister, after months of spiritual experimentation, presented characteristics of a man inhabited by multiple consciousnesses, maintaining awareness that existed simultaneously in multiple metaphysical states until the final moment. Supernatural consequences haunt participants. Professor Edmund Crowe, specialist in historical secret societies, developed a disturbing theory. The circle of spiritual transference wasn't merely manipulating theology, it was altering the local spiritual structure. The experiments may have created an anomaly that continues to affect anyone who investigates the case. Evidence of this theory: every investigator who studied Reverend Blackwood's archives developed symptoms of temporary spiritual possession, nightmares involving multiple versions of their deceased loved ones, and distorted perception of spiritual boundaries. As if knowledge of the case caused spiritual contamination. Haunted survivors break decades of terrified silence. Our investigation managed to locate 3 survivors who witnessed events of 1848, all having developed psychological disturbances that persist decades later. Their accounts, collected in interviews that needed to be interrupted multiple times due to episodes of panic, revealed details that no official document recorded. Eleanor Whitmore, church assistant who developed spiritual sensitivity. Eleanor Whitmore, now appearing supernaturally aged at 73, was a young choir member during the period of the experiments. She received us only after we presented specific credentials, and kept all windows closed during the interview, claiming that daylight makes her remember what she saw. I was only 16, Eleanor recalled with a voice that oscillated between youthful timbre and elderly tremor, but I immediately realized that something was altering the spiritual atmosphere in the church. There were corridors where hymns sounded different, sounds of weeping that seemed to come simultaneously from the past and future. Eleanor was the only person outside Winchell's team who directly witnessed Reverend Blackwood during his spiritual transformation. One night, working beyond hours, she accidentally witnessed a ritual through a basement window and was never the same. What I saw changed not only my life, but my perception of reality, she continued, her hands trembling with a rhythm that didn't correspond to her chronological age. Hooded men, candles that burned with flames that moved against the wind, and in the center a minister who existed in communion with a spirit that grew more visible with each incantation. Thomas Morrison, son of the cursed medical examiner. Thomas Morrison, 85 years old who appears to have 50, inherited not only his father's secret notes, but also a curse that affects the family's perception of spiritual boundaries. Mirrors in his home show additional reflections, and old photographs show him aging at an inconsistent rate with spectral figures appearing more clearly over time. My father knew that the experiments were altering the local spiritual structure, Thomas explained during an interview that lasted simultaneously 2 hours and 6 hours depending on the clock consulted. He found bodies with impossible spiritual characteristics. Dr. Morrison had secretly photographed victims, including Reverend Blackwood. Images show contradictions that persist decades later. When observed quickly, they show a normal minister; when contemplated longer, they reveal a man accompanied by a spectral bride; when photographed again, they appear different with each development. My father suspected that Winchell had discovered how to manipulate the veil between worlds, Thomas added. He found evidence that individuals could commune with the departed in ways that defied theological understanding, as if each soul existed in different spiritual planes simultaneously. Sarah Caldwell, survivor with fragmented spiritual memories. The most devastating testimony came from Sarah Caldwell, 88 chronological years, who appears different ages depending on the lighting. At 9 years old, she was selected for the program but managed to escape before the final procedures, although not without permanent spiritual consequences. Sarah still exhibits physical anomalies, hair that alternates between colors according to seasons, scars that appear and disappear, and reflection in mirrors that shows versions accompanied by shadowy figures. Her memories exist simultaneously in multiple spiritual lines. They kept us in cells where reality functioned strangely, Sarah recalled in the presence of her grandson, who observed uneasily how her appearance changed during conversation. There were other children, perhaps 10 or 12. Reverend Blackwood was in the adjacent cell, and I heard not only his current prayers, but echoes of communion with his daughter's spirit. Sarah described rituals where children were forced to participate in ceremonies that mixed religion with spiritual manipulation. Men in white robes chose a different child each night. When they took Reverend Blackwood, he returned existing in multiple spiritual states simultaneously. Reverend Blackwood's final moments, fragmented spiritual existence. Sarah's most disturbing description involves Reverend Blackwood's final moments. He had become something that defies description: minister, father, and spiritual bridegroom existing in the same body. One night I heard not only prayers coming from his cell, but temporal echoes of all moments of his spiritual communion happening simultaneously. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, who interviewed Sarah decades later using regressive hypnosis, confirmed authenticity through details that coincide with never-published documents. Sarah's memories show spiritual fragmentation that persists to this day. She literally remembers things she couldn't have witnessed. Spiritual curse pursues investigators. All testimonies converge. Investigating Reverend Blackwood's case causes spiritual contamination in researchers. Each person who studies the archives develops similar symptoms: distorted perception of reality, irregular spiritual experiences, memories of events they never lived. It wasn't just a theological experiment, concluded Eleanor Whitmore, whose appearance changed visibly during our interview. It was a rupture in the spiritual structure that continues to affect anyone who approaches the truth about what they did to that grieving father and his departed daughter. Temporal curse remains active. Investigation ends in terror. Our 2-year investigation revealed truths that not only shook our sanity, but altered our fundamental perception of spiritual reality. The circle of spiritual transference didn't merely conduct experiments, it created an anomaly that persists, haunting anyone who dares investigate Reverend Blackwood's case. Reverend Thaddeus Winchell never faced earthly justice. Records suggest that he may have discovered how to prolong his spiritual existence indefinitely through metaphysical manipulation, possibly existing today in an impossible state. Some investigators report sightings of a man who corresponds to his description, always appearing to have exactly the same age. Reverend Blackwood, existence that transcends death. Officially, Reverend Blackwood died in 1848. Unofficially, multiple witnesses report manifestations suggesting that he may exist simultaneously in multiple spiritual states. Visitors to the old church site describe encounters with a minister who appears to be Reverend Blackwood, always asking, "Have you seen my daughter's wedding dress?" Location remains haunted by spiritual anomaly. Today, ruins of the Montgomery County Church are avoided by local residents who report inexplicable phenomena: hymns that play without singers, shadows that move against the direction of the sun, and whispers of voices that speak about wedding vows that make no sense. Dr. Septimus Graves, pathologist who was never the same after these discoveries. Final warning: this investigation ends here for reasons of personal sanity. Remaining files will be permanently sealed. We recommend readers avoid investigating this case, as knowledge may cause irreversible spiritual contamination. Limited time for access: each person who watches this documentary reports distorted temporal perception. Some feel they watched for minutes, others for hours. Without your engagement in the next few moments, temporal revelations about spiritual manipulation will be permanently suppressed by algorithms. Like before it's too late, in any timeline.